Ivy? Okay.
You know, I think MDRC has a Washington office now, very small, like 4 people. I think so. I think Virginia Cox might be in it. I'm not positive about that, but I think that. Well, I meant to have my, I'm going to come back. I forgot something, sorry.
No worries. Time.
You made it.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I love it when people do that. I'm Sarah Rosen-Mortel, and I have the great privilege to be the president of the Urban Institute and to welcome all of you here today. Let me just first briefly also welcome our online audience, those who are either watching live or watching the stream later. For those of you who are watching live, we want to encourage you to participate, and those in the room, in a digital conversation. So today your digital devices are not for email while we're having this great conversation, but they certainly are for sharing your thoughts and observations with a larger community. So feel free to tweet or otherwise send your thoughts using the hashtag, if you would, #LiveAtUrban, so others who are weighing in on this conversation can find you as well. And if you are online and you want to send in questions we'll have a Q&A session later on in the program, if you send them to events@urban.org, we'll try to weave those in with the questions in the room. So let me thank you for joining us today for what is the 2016 Paul Offner Lecture, which will be a discussion about evidence-informed policies and steps that federal actors can take to improve opportunities for children. The Paul Offner Lecture is a collaboration between the Urban Institute and the University of Wisconsin's Follette School of Public Affairs. And I want to say thank you to the director of that school, Donald Moynihan, and with 2 of his colleagues who are here with us today, Hillary Shager and Bridget Persch, and make a special welcome to the 20 students from the La Follette School who are with us today as well. Since 2007, Urban and La Follette have been honoring Paul Offner's legacy of education, research, and government service, working in each sector as he did, all in support of providing better outcomes for low and moderate income Americans. Paul Offner's career included work for the DC city government, for the Senate Finance Committee, for the Ohio State Department of Human Affairs. He was served in both houses of the Wisconsin legislature and had many other positions as well that I won't mention, but the one that is near and dear to our hearts is that he was at the Urban Institute and was a cherished and respected colleague by many of the folks who served with him here at Urban. Molly Offner, Paul's wife, there she is. Hey, Molly. Is here with us today, and she is the heart and spirit who's really worked to help us together with La Follette develop programs for something that brings together the 3 parts of Paul's career: public service, education, and research to inform better outcomes. Now, we are days away from an election that can't come soon enough. Please. And whoever is elected, they will be responsible for many things. Not alone, but importantly responsible for one of the most important and in many ways cherished responsibilities of public service. How do we provide opportunities for our families, for especially our children, and especially for those to whom start their lives with the least opportunity and assets? Particularly today's discussion is going to focus on how do we encourage education, create opportunities for children, and what does the evidence say works best by encouraging and rewarding not only education but work, and what are the meaningful opportunities for to provide work to families and to support and create family stability. I want to spend just one moment before I turn it over to the panel to say a word to the students who are here today. Each of you are pursuing an education that makes it possible for you, too, to pursue a career in public service. The people you're going to hear from in this discussion, three of whom are Paul Offner's former colleagues and co-collaborators, they are distinguished, there's no doubt, and Nisha is going to explain their backgrounds a little bit more. But what they really are they're people who embody those same characteristics that Paul Offner brought in his career. They live at a time when public policy is not always conceived of as the noble profession, that Washington is occasionally denigrated. But in fact, these three speakers represent the very best in public policy. First and foremost, they work from evidence. They look and start from what do the facts tell us, what are new forms of information we can bring to bear, and then we try to do things that are informed by that and not just our own impulse. Secondly, they work across the ideological divide. They engage with others who bring different ideas to the table in a spirit of collegiality and respect, with ears open to learn from one another. And as a result, they build partnerships that make them effective in change. They've dedicated their careers to the goal of helping the public sector work better for people, most especially our children and families, and they are innovative, insightful, and wise. And I hope that as you consider your career, both Paul Offner and the folks on our panel today provide an inspiration for that higher order of public service that you might pursue. The panel we have today includes, we've been very proud to say, our very own Eugene Steuerle, Institute Fellow here, and Nisha will, as well as two partners from Brookings, who is a partner institution of ours in many ways, Bell Sawhill, Ron Haskins, and I'll let Nisha introduce them. But they will be moderated in a discussion today with Urban's own Nisha Patel. Last year, the Gates Foundation came to Urban and asked us to work with them to create something called the U.S. Partnership for Mobility from Poverty, which is a 2+ year inquiry into what are those few big bets, the things that we ought to focus on if we really want to move the needle on helping future generations lift out of poverty and achieve economic and social mobility. Nisha she's the executive director of that effort and brings a deep background in the challenges facing children in low-income families from her work first as a program officer at the Gates Foundation, as deputy director of the Ascend program at the Aspen Institute, where she focused on expanding two-generation strategies, and most recently serving in the Obama administration as director of the Office of Family Assistance. So you have four superlative illustrations of what the Paul Offner legacy means, and I wish all of you a great time in your visit to Washington, particularly to our student guests, and to all of you. Thank you for being here. Nisha, it's all yours. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you, Sarah. In addition to this fabulous panel, which I'm going to introduce, I'm looking around. We've got an amazing crowd here. I'm looking around the room, and I see a lot of old friends and some new friends, and I know we've got a great virtual audience joining us as well. So on this panel, in addition just to being the illustrious, having the illustrious careers that they have, I'm noting that we have two economists and one developmental psychologist. And I'm really glad I'm sitting next to Ron, because those of you that know me, you know that I always like to bring the human element. So if we start getting too wonky with the economists, I'm counting on you, Ron, to bring back that human element. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of these folks, but one of the things all three of them have in common, in addition to just their intellect, is they all have recent books with really catchy titles. So I just want to, their most recent books, I'm blown away. So Gene, Dead Man Ruling, Ron, Show Me the Evidence, and Belle, Generation Unbound, Drifting into Sex and Parenthood Without Marriage. I mean, if you've got titles with sex and death and everything.
It's a total coincidence.
Yeah, yeah.
They didn't intend that at all. Yeah.
It's going to be a great panel. So immediately to my left is Ron Haskins, who is a senior fellow in the Economic Studies program and co-director of the Center on Children and Families at the Brookings Institution. He's also a senior consultant at the Annie Casey Foundation. And he was recently appointed by House Speaker Paul Ryan to head the Bipartisan Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. Prior to all of that work, he spent 14 years on the staff of the House Ways and Means Human Resources Subcommittee. He was instrumental in the design of the 1996 Welfare Reform Law. And then next to Ron, his co-conspirator, Belle Sawhill, who is also a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. And she previously served as vice president and director of that program. And she has been a co-director with Ron of the Center on Children and Families. She's also been a senior fellow here at the Urban Institute. And prior to that, during the Clinton administration, she served as associate director of OMB. And this will blow you away. Her responsibilities included all of the human resource programs of the federal government, which is a third of the federal budget. So that's a very powerful person. Yeah, I have to run this panel. And then finally, Eugene Steuerle, who is an Institute Fellow and also the Richard B. Fisher Chair here at the Urban Institute. And among his past positions, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Treasury Department for Tax Analysis, President of the National Tax Association, and also previously co-director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. So lots of partnerships on this panel. And Gene was also chair of the 2015-16 National Academy of Sciences, very relevant to this discussion today, Committee on Advancing the Power of Economic Evidence to Inform Investments in Children, Youth, and Families. Okay, so that's a little bit about our panel. And I'm going to kick off the conversation. I'm going to actually start down at the end with Gene. And Gene, your analysis highlights a threat to children's share of the federal budget. And so for folks in the room who may not yet be federal budget experts, can you explain a couple things? First, what's causing the squeeze on federal dollars for children in the budget? And then second, for our conversation today, what can a new administration do to free up resources for programs that will work for children and their families?
If one looks closely, oh, by the way, I should say I'm really delighted to be here with this panel. Not only the three colleagues here who I admire greatly, but particularly to be here for the Paul Offner Lecture. I had the opportunity to have a strong Wisconsin connection to him. I went to graduate school when he was in the legislature, and I was looking forward even to working more with him here at the Urban Institute. So terrific guy. So really honored to be here. But quickly answer your question. If you look at the budget, this would often do, the budget is basically a balance sheet. And so a lot of the story in terms of what's going to happen over here depends on what's going to happen over there. And the story I tell, it largely relates to where we've built growth into the budget and where we haven't. And it turns out that we just have not built growth into children's programs. And over a period of actually about 3 or 4 decades, there's been increasing competition between the political parties to build growth into what they wanted. I'm saying growth, but in terms of how the commitments. So we've built a huge amount of growth into health and retirement programs on the one side, and then we've also built a lot of efforts to reduce taxes on the other. So we often think of that as just a deficit issue. But it's not really just a deficit issue, because the traditional deficit, if you didn't have growth built in, the economy would grow, revenues would rise, and you'd have the opportunity to do new things. And I think children would win out in that type of, not always, but they'd win their share of things in that type of budget. But there's so much of a commitment now to keeping taxes low and having everything to go to health and retirement. By the way, the kids only get a tiny piece of the health budget. That basically they're getting squeezed. And so one of the studies we put out here we call Kids Share. You're welcome to look at it. And it basically traces through the history of programs for children. You can debate whether every program we classify as a child's program should be classified or not. But I think largely speaking, everybody has agreed with the direction of the numbers. And the really hard part of the story is the growth in the future, particularly over the next 10 years. Nothing is really going to kids. Nothing's going to infrastructure, by the way. I mean, it's all retirement, health, and interest on the debt, and actually exploding because we don't even have the revenues, growth to pay for that. So that's what's squeezing children. And I think that a president, in this answer, I think a president has to take leadership and has to tackle this problem directly. I don't think you can just go do it by nickels and dimes. I think a lot of what you even see in the presidential campaign, if you look on the spending side of the budget, is small ball, and it's not going to really get us there in the grand scheme of things. You know, we've got this budget that's pretty large, you know, $3 trillion or more dollars. We're supposed to have $1 trillion more roughly in revenues 10 years from now. We could allocate that for things like children or some portion of it. We're just not doing it.
Okay. So I'm going to go next to Belle. So thinking about the context that Jean laid out, you've recently proposed an agenda that I read with great interest, an agenda for the new administration around reducing poverty and improving opportunity. So from your perspective, what are the key barriers to economic mobility for children and families, and what are the most effective solutions that a new administration might implement to address them?
Well, before I get to that question, I also want to say something about Paul Offner. And I met Paul when I was teaching at Georgetown Law School, and I went and asked someone, I'd never met him, tell me about Paul Offner. And what I was told was he was the smartest senior aide on the Hill at that time that they had ever encountered. And I was totally intimidated, totally intimidated, and learned a great deal from him. So it's a real privilege to be here in his honor today and to see Molly and so forth. So on barriers to mobility and how to reduce poverty, I think that there are three, and we've talked about this a lot at Brookings. Ron and I both have talked about it. The first is not enough education. We at least need to get people through high school and preferably, of course, get them much more than that. Secondly, jobs. If everybody worked full-time, if there was just one member of every household that worked full-time, it could make a huge difference. Thirdly, stable families. And what we have shown in our research is that if you could just manage to do three things, first of all, make sure that everybody does graduate high school. Secondly, make sure that there is one full-time worker in every household. And thirdly, make sure that nobody has children until they're in a stable, committed relationship with another adult. If you could do those three things, I'm not saying it's easy, you could reduce the poverty rate, which is right now about 13.5%, to about 2%. So the challenge then becomes, how do we do those three things? And in our paper, which I think there are copies here, and it's also online, for those of you who might be interested in more detail that I can talk about today. On the first, we have an evidence-based set of proposals that I think would achieve a lot of the first goal, making sure that everybody has a reasonable level of education. It involves everything from home visiting to high-quality early childhood education to successful reading programs in elementary school and reform of our high schools. On the jobs front, I'm, as you said earlier, Nisha, an economist, and I care deeply about the qualitative stuff, but as an economist, I want to really press home a point that I think doesn't get made enough, and particularly not in social policy circles. And that is that the most important anti-poverty problem is a job, and the most important jobs program is a full employment economy. It's not very complicated, but I want to really stress that in recent decades, we have rarely had a full employment economy. Now, we appear to be getting back to one right now. As you all know, the unemployment rate is around 5%. In the late 90s, by the way, we got it down to 4%, and in the late 90s, people at the bottom did very well. Employment and earnings for them went up. Similarly, the Census Bureau has recently put out a report saying between 2014 and 15, there's always a lag here, finally, because the unemployment rate had come down, people at the bottom were moving ahead, disproportionately moving ahead. So full employment is critical, and that means the right kind of fiscal and monetary policies, and we could go into that. Now, I don't think that full employment is, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. I think we may have a growing problem of what we usually call structural unemployment. People who, even in a full employment economy, for one reason or other, cannot find a job. And I have some ideas about that, but in interest of time, I'll leave that for later. Thirdly, on the family stability. Most of you probably know that right now 40% of all children in America are born outside of marriage, and it's 50% if you're under 30, if you're part of the millennial generation. And if these people who are having children outside of marriage were in stable relationships, I wouldn't care that they're not married, but they're not in stable relationships. I would also not care if they were planning and choosing to have the children. We have an increasing number of what I call single mothers by choice in our society, but they're typically older women who have the wherewithal and have made a deliberate, intentional choice to have a child. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the 60% of this population that's having children not only outside of marriage and in an unstable relationship, but it was unplanned. It was unintended by the woman herself. That's what she has told us. And so if we could encourage and empower, especially young women, because they're the ones who use birth control, to not have unplanned pregnancies before they want to have a child, my book that Nisha was nice enough to mention shows we could make huge progress against poverty and we could have more social mobility. So I'll leave it at there in terms of opening comments.
Okay, great. Lots to unpack there, but I'm going to go to Ron, and I'm going to riff off of one thing that I heard Belle say when she was talking particularly about education, that her proposals include evidence-based proposals to get at economic mobility. And so, Ron, you have actually complimented, starting with the current administration, you've complimented the current administration on their use of evidence to inform policies and programs. So thinking about a new administration, what more can a new administration do to use evidence to inform initiatives, particularly initiatives that are directed at children and families?
Well, I'm going to continue the trend of kicking things off by talking about Paul. My perspective is a little bit different because I was on the other side of the aisle. And this was during the welfare reform days, and Paul had worked for Senator Moynihan, who was the most ferocious opponent of welfare reform. He said delightful things like, if welfare reform passed, they were going to have to send carts around in the winter mornings in New York City to pick up the dead babies. So the level of invective was really spectacular, both in the House and in the Senate. Go back and look at the debate. And yet, Paul and I maintained, I think, a very respectful relationship, mostly because my standard line was, yep, yep. But I had tremendous respect for Paul from the other side of the aisle. We didn't agree, there are a lot of things we didn't agree on, so I think that's a real test, especially here in Washington, and especially today, because it's so rare. So we miss Paul a great deal, and I'm sorry for this lecture and to maintain contact with Molly all these years. There's no question that this administration is the most data-oriented, evidence-based administration ever. There's not even any contest. And the things that have started under the tutelage of the administration are just spectacular. There's a whole range of things, many from the private sector, some from foundations. I'm thinking of Results First, for example, which was started by Pew and MacArthur. And the explicit goal is to get states to stop spending their money on stuff that doesn't work and start spending on stuff that works. And amazing states like Mississippi and New Mexico, who's the last person you heard use New Mexico and Mississippi as a sparkling example of what policy ought to be like. But they have both actually done this. They have ended programs and used that money for effective programs. So I think that's the most important thing. There are many, many others that are going on. Obama started 6 programs that are based on this idea of spending the money on things that work. And the administration set up a whole machinery of, well, what do you mean by things that work? What's the definition of that? And how do you pay for it? And what do you do about innovation? And the answer is you spend some money on innovation, but most of the money on stuff that has strong evidence that it works. So it's a great idea. All 6 of these programs have been implemented. There are evaluations that already exist on 4 of them. And there's one coming in 2018 on home visiting, which is the biggest of the programs, so more than 700 sites around the United States. And these evaluations are showing us, I think, a very troubling thing. We know our programs don't work. It's hard to get everybody to admit that, but our programs just don't work. And this strategy is an attempt to make them work. So we just had, about 4 weeks ago, a big dump. No one ever heard of anything like this before. 41 studies, mostly random assignment, of teen pregnancy prevention programs, roughly half of which had strong evidence that they worked. And the success rate on any variable was in the 30% area, so 70% didn't work very well. But they were not on the most important variable, which is actually reducing teen pregnancy. Now, there's a lot to get into there, but these programs they're not super effective, even though that's the goal of the program, to use model programs that have been shown to be effective. So we have a long ways to go, even with this new strategy, and that's what I hope the new administration will do. I don't care if they didn't do anything new. If they took over where this administration left off with regard to OMB, the evidence-based and tiered evidence initiatives, and several other initiatives, and keep Institute for Education Sciences going and so forth, that would be a huge achievement. And I know this is crazy, but I think there's one of the candidates that if that person happened to win, all of this stuff would be in big trouble.
Can't imagine who it is.
Well, so we're going to talk about evidence a fair amount in this conversation, but for a moment, I want to sort of, I guess, pull up from it and say, we will talk, and we've talked already about the importance of putting resources into evidence-based programs. But my question is for Ron, but really for all of you on the panel, is there also room for innovation in the federal budget, for funding innovation? And what I mean by that is, should it be the role of government to also test new ideas that haven't been tried before to figure out if they'll work, or is that a role best left to philanthropy?
Let me give you 2 statements, both of which I think are correct. One is that all of the Obama initiatives, all 6 of them, explicitly make room for innovation. There was a huge debate about this in the White House, and the president himself got involved, as far as I can tell. I discussed this in the book. And so, for example, teen pregnancy, 25% of the money has to be spent on programs that are promising. And all the initiatives are like that. They reserve money for innovation. And I3, invested in education, that was carried out by the Department of Education, same thing, except they had more categories of evidence. They envisioned a buildup of evidence, a pipeline, if you will, of evidence-based programs that would gradually get more effective, more effective, more effective. So the answer is yes, there is explicitly room for innovation. That is what the administration intended. The second thing is that, interestingly, the teen pregnancy prevention, about roughly half of the programs were in the category of their in effect, replications. They're programs that have strong evidence of success, usually from random assignment studies. And then the second tranche of programs is programs that are promising but don't necessarily have strong evidence. And neither set produced very spectacular outcomes. So this distinction between innovation and evidence-based programs it's difficult. You can't always tell the difference. So it's something we need to work on. But whatever we do, we have to reserve money for innovation. There's no question about it.
Okay, very happy to hear you say that. Gene, do you want to comment on that as well?
Well, we struggle with this issue a lot in this National Academy report, and I'll give you partly my own conclusion, but partly the conclusion of a lot of people in the committee. We talk about evidence often, particular researchers, we like to talk about the complete cost-benefit analysis. This program produced an 8% rate of return. And sometimes statisticians like to say, well, if we do something called randomized controlled trials, we get perfect statistical results. It's rigorous statistically. But when we talk about evidence more generally in evaluation, there's a lot of things that are short of that can help you. So for instance, cost effectiveness analysis doesn't really measure fully whether the cost justify the benefits, but it does tell you, given that I'm going to spend this amount of money, if I move the money over here, I can do a little better. Or if I'm in a Head Start program, we may still have this ongoing debate as to whether Head Start is really fully functional, which by the way, is a tough issue because Head Start over here in this city, or this particular part of the city, is not necessarily like Head Start in another part. So it makes it hard to make generalizations. But you often can come in and say, you know what, we have discovered that better quality teachers produce better outcomes. So there's a lot of evidence like that that we need to bring to the core. And one of the things I've argued in a brief on Opportunity for All is I think you can put demands on the system to produce a lot of evidence to the extent they can. So for instance, we don't really measure in almost any program, CBL doesn't do it, OMB doesn't do it, is it encouraging work? Bell talked about work being one of the most important parts of solving this problem for families. I mean, even, and this goes a little bit to the family, but we could even say, this might sound really way out of the realm, but we could go to the Defense Department and say, we want you to compete among your departments to see whether when people leave military service, they get jobs. And we're going to measure you on that. Now, that's not the full type of analysis I know that we ideally want, but I think there's a lot of ways of putting evidence into the system that falls short of our ultimate demand on proving something works, which always bothers me as an issue. And even if we know it works, you always want the next analysis. All performance measurement says that you want continual improvement. So saying something works and we're going to create some standard across the country that we're just going to replicate everywhere in some ways is a little misleading. You want every program to be continually improving. If you have a program in schools, you want those teachers constantly figuring out what new things they can do. And you can't just sit around and say, well, but that's not on our agenda for X, Y, and Z exactly leads to A, B, and C. So I'm actually reinforcing, I think, what Bell and Ron are saying. I'm just saying I think there are a lot of ways of getting at it that doesn't necessarily meet the full rigorous standard of proving something works and produces some rate of return somehow measured.
Bellen, do you want to add anything to that?
Absolutely. You asked about innovation, which I think is a great question, and I just want to give a couple of examples of innovation that I've seen recently that I'm excited about and that hasn't been evaluated because it's new. Ron talked about teen pregnancy prevention programs, and he mentioned that not all of them have been successful and that they move the needle some, but not a lot. So what would be innovation in that field? I'll tell you what it is. It's going online. The idea that you give kids, think kids, where are kids? They're online. And you might get them for, a half an hour or an hour in a health class in middle or high school, but, they're bored at that time. They're not listening. They're a little, restless. But when it comes time that they need the information because they're getting into a romantic or a sexual relationship, where do they go? They go online. So we need sex education for the 21st century is going to be online, not in the classroom. And an organization that I'm affiliated with in addition to Brookings called the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy is working on that right now to create sex education for the 21st century, and it will be online. Second example, if you want to really help people avoid unplanned pregnancy when they're in college or still in school, you need your college and your school-based health centers to offer long-acting forms of contraception. By and large, they don't right now. So that's, again, an area where we don't have an RCT, but I would argue that this is innovative and that this, from everything we do know, apropos of what Jean was arguing, could be highly effective. We have enough evidence, I think, right now to move forward with that. The third thing I would say is we can't let a whole generation of children wait until the research community figures out everything we need to know about what works and what doesn't. And the fourth thing I would say is that you need to worry about whether, if you're an OMB, as I was, and you have 1/3 of the federal budget under your supervision, so to speak, and you're being asked to decide, should we spend another $1 billion on this education program or another $1 billion on this home visiting program or another $1 billion on this jobs program, how do you decide? There might be a individual RCT on each of those programs separately, but they have different metrics, different outcomes that they're measuring. Using the kind of model that we've created at Brookings and that now is a partnership with the Urban Institute and Child Trends, we can tell you whether that $1 billion is going to have a bigger impact on the expected lifetime income of the person receiving a program from each of those very different interventions. You can't do that without that kind of life cycle model that I'm very proud of, and so I'm arguing about it now.
And that's the social genome
That's
modeling.
the social genome project. I see Tim Smeeting over here. He's used it, and I'm sure there are other people in the room here who know about it as well. Oh, there's Greg. Sorry, Greg, didn't see you. Greg Ox runs the project here at Urban.
We have a room full of modelers. Okay. So I actually wanted to pick up on one of the strands that you talked about, Belle, and just as you laid out some of the different things that you think need to happen around teen and unplanned pregnancy prevention, and one of those was around LARCs, or long-acting reversible contraception, which has gotten a fair amount of media attention in the last couple of weeks, I think in large part to the work of the national campaign, and was fascinated to see some of the new maps they have on their website, these sort of heat maps that show you where there is access in different states. And it's sort of surprising. It's kind of unexpected. There's more access in some places than you might think. But that we've been talking about it here with colleagues at Urban, and one of the things that we saw recently this week in the media was a study in the UK looking at something akin to LARCs for men. But in fact, that study was discontinued, I guess, because people in the study were complaining about side effects. So thoughts about sort of there's a fair amount of focus on women with unplanned pregnancy. What about the men? And I'll invite others to chime in as well, but I want to start with you, Belle.
I'm not familiar with I read, as you did, a little bit about the new attempt to help men prevent pregnancy, but I don't know a lot about it, and it's very technical. I will tell you that most people don't know this, that the most common, almost the most common form of birth control in America is sterilization. Wow. It and the pill are neck and neck. You know, they both are about equally important. And that's very little known, but a lot of people, when they complete their family size and they say, you know, I don't want to have that third, fourth, fifth child, they get sterilized. But it's the women that get sterilized. And it turns out that male sterilization, called a vasectomy, is much safer, much cheaper, much easier than female. In all other countries like the UK, I mean not all other, but I mean other advanced countries, the health service pays for both male and female sterilization. In America, we don't. In America, we only pay for female sterilization. We don't pay for male sterilization. And my colleague, Richard Reeves, has gotten very interested in this, asked Secretary Burwell just last week, why is it that you guys under ACA don't pay for this, given that it's much safer, much easier, much, has less side effects, all that. And she didn't know. But we hope she's gone back and talked to her staff about it.
Yeah. Well, let's bring speaking of the men into the conversation. Jean, Ron, thoughts about, what do we know, what evidence do we have about programs that actually work for young men and sort of preventing unintended pregnancies?
Child support.
It stands to reason. I'm not sure the data is all that persuasive, but it stands to reason if we had a very effective child support system that this would be a way to wake men up a little bit, that if you have a baby, you got an 18-year responsibility. And we do that. The problem is, at least in my estimation, the problem is that low-income men, we have a good colleague named Ron Mincy, and Ron Mincy says you can't get blood out of a turnip, by which he means the guys that the highest rates of non-marital births among low and minority families, and those are exactly guys that aren't employed. So how can they pay? And a lot of them are in prison. That's another huge problem that the child support system is trying to do with. So I don't think, at this point, I would not have a lot of confidence that child support is going to act as a good birth control program. And I think we really lack a lot of information. We lack information about what would make men more committed to making sure they don't have babies. One of the problems is, and it's somewhat the problem with women too, is that they're not clear that they don't want a baby. I think there's a whole spectrum here of some people, they really do want a baby, they brag about it and so forth, all the way to, no, I don't want to have a baby. But there are a lot of people in the middle who it's not totally clear exactly what they want to do. And so they believe in fate and if God intends it and all kinds of wonderful things that they say. And of course, pregnancies occur with an alarming rate when that happens. So I think we're more or less nowhere on effective ways to have men play an important role in reducing unplanned and teen pregnancy.
Okay, so an area that's maybe ripe for research. We actually don't know a lot about how to engage men.
Well, maybe that's what this UK thing, I don't know enough details about that. I'm going to look it up and see exactly what was going on.
You know, I think we also need to go back to the fact that, you know, this birth control of any sort is simply a means, a mechanism, a tool. You have to create some opportunity in people's lives in order to give them the motivation, not just the means, to prevent a birth. And the other point that I always want to make about this is people say, well, the young people themselves may be somewhat ambivalent. I think that's true, as Ron just said. But we know for a fact it's not good for the child. The child's life chances will be adversely impacted if the child is the result of a very early, unplanned birth outside of marriage.
I like your point on motivation. It's what I like to call, and people here in the room know this, larks and sparks. We need larks, but also sparks of hope for young people.
You know, let me add something to this. We have a very effective method that Bell has already described. We should be putting a huge effort, and Burwell, this would have been a good answer. We know this. We know that larks are close to 100% effective. We have very good data, big studies, even random assignment, almost whole states, Iowa and Colorado. So we know a lot about it. We know it would work if we focused on doing as much as we can with larks, always giving women choice. We know that if given choice, about 70% select a lark. We could make a lot of progress. And I think we ought to have backup systems and we ought to have innovation and all the stuff we've talked about. But when you find a solution that's as effective as larks, we ought to really drive that solution.
For those in the audience who don't know what a LARC is, it's an IUD or an implant. It can last for 5 years or more and is, according to the American College of OBGYN, absolutely safe, should be the first line of defense for any woman who doesn't want to get pregnant.
Okay, Gene's been trying to get in for a little while.
Sorry.
Well, actually, the first part was just a little anecdote. Is the relationships among us as well as some of the people in the audience go back quite a way. So at one point, actually, my daughter worked for Bell at the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. She may not remember that. And at one point, she got her picture on one of the pamphlets, and I think she was still a teenager. And there's always this question: is she on the pamphlet as a teenager? What is she representing? The person who's most in need, or a worker? But I do, and I keep going. I have not studied this particular issue about the best form of sex education or sex or control, but there is evidence from like the finance literature that just teaching people like what's the best way to invest your money doesn't really work. That a lot of stuff, I'm going to use the term, is hands-on. It's practice. So I'm not telling we're going to go in and tell people how to do things, but I think you have to at some point be somewhat explicit about what the opportunities are. It's just not preaching to people. For the most part, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in finance, and I don't know whether it works so much here. And there's a second little part of the story, again, the fact that everything, at least everything else, is the simple fact is it helps a lot. I mean, the one thing I think any parent knows who has a teenager who says, keep your kid busy. You know, don't have them bored in the afternoon or even in the evening where they're running around and looking for things. I'm serious. This could prevent a lot of teen pregnancy, and we do not, in our school system, do a lot for those people who are not at the top of the system, the middle system. And we have this grading system that tells you you're a failure because you're getting C's and everybody else is getting B's and A's, and so therefore you should try to get a C plus and you're going to feel good, and you're not. You know, we need programs that are going to encourage them in what they can do. We've emphasized, in my view, too much the notion that everybody can go to college, that everybody can go to college, and we've neglected people who don't. We've neglected a lot things like apprenticeships, my friend like Bob Lerman pushes, and things that actually keep them active, motivated, and engaged in other things in society. And I think that's part of this puzzle.
Okay, I'm gonna shift gears and move us to kind of a different topic, which is thinking about the context and where we are in 2016. You know, we're in the context of this election coming up in 5 days. Who knows what's going to happen? We could be headed into dramatically different directions. But sort of beyond just the election, what, if anything, is unique about this moment in 2016? You're all people that have been engaged in this work for decades. And so I'm really interested in specifically hearing from you about where do you think political will is in this country in terms of the possibility for investments in children? Is the context different than it was a decade ago, 20 years ago with welfare reform, 30 years ago? You can pick your decade, but and I'll start with Gene actually and work our way down.
Well, I have to go back to, as we all do, somewhat to the things that I've studied. If you look at the budget as a whole, I mean, I doubt very few people here, even if you've studied, actually do the numbers and actually say, well, how much does government spend per household? It turns out government at all levels, if you add in all the tax subsidies, state, local, federal, we spend about $61,000 per household right now. And if you talk about direct support programs, which programs for children often fit into, it's about $35,000. And that number, the $61,000, is supposed to grow in 10 years from now to $74,000. So my point here is there are a lot of resources. You know, I know we are not growing as fast as we want, but we are at extraordinarily rich society, and even at modest growth rates, we become richer. There's a lot of money, a lot of resources to do things if we start doing them right, if we follow Bell and Ron and others who tell us to really examine what works and shift money there. But there's a lot of money there per cap. I mean, household GDP is somewhat in excess of $130,000 a household. So we can do, if it's a matter of resources, we can do a lot of things. Unfortunately, as I say, all the commitment, all the growth in the system, even beyond what our additional resources are going to provide, go for health, and not usually health for children, health and retirement, and interest on the debt, because we're not willing to collect enough taxes. And I think you've got to tackle that problem, the resource problem, at the same time. That's sort of a top-down approach. At the same time, you do the bottom-up approach of saying, okay, now let's put more and more into what works. You can't put more money into what works if you've already pre-committed this system. And it's this next 10 years where more so than any time in our history, that pre-commitment dominates the budget. We committed the revenue growth, the close to $1 trillion in additional revenues we're expecting 10 years from now. We've committed close to $1.5 trillion, which is $500 billion more. And Hillary Clinton says she's going to raise taxes by $100 billion. That doesn't solve that problem. And she wants to spend that $100 billion on a lot of things over here, some things for children. It's just not going to solve. You've got to get, if you're dealing with resources, you've got to tackle that big problem. And it's never been worse. There's never been such a level of pre-commitment. But that level of pre-commitment doesn't mean that we're not sitting with our backs to an extraordinary ocean of opportunity. We're just not looking at it. We're not facing it.
So, Belle, do we have the political will to shift our budget priorities?
Well, obviously, it's going to depend hugely on what happens in this election. And let's assume for the moment, not being partisan, that Hillary Clinton is going to win. But that we're going to still have a Republican Congress, at least a Republican House, if not a Republican Senate. So that means we're going to still have some disagreements, and we're going to have to find some way around them. How might we do that? I'll talk about three where I think there's some possibility of compromise. The first would be infrastructure. I talked earlier about how important jobs are. And so, you all know this story about, if we invested in infrastructure, it would not only improve the country, which is falling apart as far as I'm concerned, physically falling apart, but it would provide a lot of good jobs. Secondly, on children, there is a proposal that's come out of the Clinton campaign for a much enhanced child tax credit. And there's already a child tax credit, but it doesn't help people at the bottom of the income distribution very much. It's partly refundable, but it doesn't get as much money to people at the bottom as it does in the middle and at the top. So her proposal, Hillary's proposal, is to increase the child tax credit to $2,000 for families with children under the age of 5. And for all families with children who are poor, she increases the amount of the refundability of the credit. So it gets a lot of money into the hands of low-income children and their families. There will be, the reason I think there's some room for compromise here is because there is a piece of legislation, proposed legislation already, was put forward earlier by Senators Lee and Rubio, and it also calls for an increase in the child tax credit. Now, their version of the child tax credit didn't help people at the bottom. So there's now room for negotiation between a Clinton plan that helps people at the bottom as well as in the middle, and something like the Lee-Rubio plan that helps people in the middle and the top, but not at the bottom. So, you know, you can see the people sitting in a smoke-filled room. I guess we don't have smoke-filled rooms anymore, but anyway.
Just hot air.
Just in the hot air room talking about this. I also think there's some room for compromise on the earned income tax credit for childless individuals. Right now, the earned income tax credit, which is, along with food stamps, our most important or biggest anti-poverty program, is very generous for families with children, but very ungenerous for people without children. But there have been proposals that have been supported on both the Republican and the Democratic side to increase that for individuals in low-wage jobs who don't yet have children, but who need to be earning more than, you know, $7, $8 an hour. Minimum wage, I think, is another one where and Ron can speak to this, where I doubt that the Republicans in Congress will go along with it, with an increase at the national level, but we're seeing states really enacting a lot more generous minimums, and I think eventually that's going to splash back at the national level and lead to an increase even at the in the national minimum wage.
As a footnote on the earned income credit, the proposals that have been out there so far have been to take one portion of the excluded population and provide a substitute, that's childless workers, but it does it in a way that actually often increases marriage penalties, which Belle and Ron are worried about, because there's another group that gets excluded, and that's the low-wage worker who happens to marry into a family. That particular person is still in a situation where if they marry into the family, they may reduce the combined credits of the family. So actually, a strong disincentive to marriage. Now, whether it affects marriage that much is an open question, but if we're trying to get to all the excluded groups that the current income credit doesn't cover, I think we have to go beyond the childless credit. There's a lot of details like that. I think we might even agree on this, that you have to deal with when you go down this route.
Well, so the question was about political will, and a lot of the policy ideas you identified, Belle, you know, they're not necessarily with the child tax credit, but they're tied to work, right? In order to be eligible for these tax credits, income supplements, they're tied to work. And I really want to hear your broader answer, Ron, but I'm really interested in what you think about the potential of programs.
The new child tax credit is very lightly. I mean, you only have to have $1 of income per year, so you know, in effect, it's not tied to work. I'd say.
Well, it's still tied to work because
it's
even if you're
rhetorically
working,
tied to work.
but no, more than that. If you're earning $3,000 or $4,000 a year, it's a pittance.
I'm talking about Clinton's proposal.
I know that. It starts at the first dollar, but what you think you're going to take people out of poverty with a tax credit that people who earn $3,000 a year?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Well,
furthermore, half of young black males between 18 and 24 do not work at all. So anything tied to work I think is a problem. I mean, we should have it. I support it, and it's had a tremendous impact. But if we're thinking about the last step now, I think we have to be thinking beyond work. I want to say.
Can I ask you a specific question about that, though? Because it's just thinking about the programs, that many of which you've highlighted, that have a strong evidence base. So one of the programs, federally funded programs out there that have a strong, decades of evidence base, are home visiting programs, which are actually not tied to work, but they're having...
Okay, I think you're going to get a big shock in 2 years. And you're going to find out the same thing we found out about these teen pregnancy prevention programs. Most of them, even the ones based on evidence, do not work. This is where we are. And the people who are saying evidence is the answer, I think they're right. But boy, do we have a lot of work to do. And we already found out with teen pregnancy prevention, most of those programs that had strong evidence of success from good studies did not produce an impact. So, to think that if we're all evidence-based policy going to solve everything, I don't think that's right. And I think with home visiting, it'll be even worse. And we'll have an even better study. MDRC is doing it right now. We're going to get all kinds of information from home visiting programs all over the country. Some of them will work. Most of them will not. We won't get main effects. I want to make a point here. I think it's impossible to be optimistic.
Did anybody hear that? It's impossible to be optimistic.
Here's why. Bell already said, and I completely agree, AEI and Brookings worked together to do a report, and half liberals, half conservatives, people that you all know, some people here in this audience, and we agreed right at the beginning that if you wanted to have a big impact, you have to do something about family composition, you have to do something about work rates, and you have to do something to increase education. All this especially applied to low-income minority families. And Chapter 2 in that report goes through the data of where we are over the last 40 years on all of those measures. They're all going the wrong direction. All of them. And if we had effective government policy, it might make us even, because what's going on out in the country is pushing us in the wrong direction. So even if government is effective, we might not make any progress at all. So that's really, and then Gene's point about the budget, Gene did not talk about projections, and everybody knows projections involve the future, which makes them inexact. But under every set of projections, we are accumulating debt, and we're moving further and further and further. Under one set of projections with an alternative baseline, we could be 140% of GDP within, I think it's 40 years. And even under the CBO projections, we're going to be very close to 90%, which a lot of people think is it's a danger zone, so that our debt equals 90% of the nation's productivity in a given year. And yet, when Wallace, God bless him, pressed the candidates on this, Trump lied. There's no other way to say it, he just lied. His budget will take us to 105% within 10 years. I think there's a lot of agreement on that. Clinton was proud of herself. I don't increase the debt by a penny. That's virtually a quote, all right? But the debt is already increasing. She doesn't do anything about it. So Wallace's question was exactly right. Neither of them seem to be concerned about it. They don't have a plan. So how can you think that we're going to solve this, dead men ruling that Gene talks about when the budget for Social Security, Medicare, and interest on the debt, which is the cause of why money is moving away from kids, they're on automatic pilot. Congress does not even vote on them. They just keep going.
So, by the way, Ron, the definition of a pessimist is someone who, when he smells the scent of flowers, looks around for a casket.
Well, I'm actually going to see if we can move the conversation to a more optimistic framework. So in a couple of minutes, I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. So be thinking about your questions. And if you're joining us virtually, remember that you can submit questions to events@urban.org. So before we go to the audience, I'm going to ask one, because Ron got me thinking about the future. It's actually a question, I didn't have the privilege of knowing Paul Offner, but I knew a bit about his work. And I know that one of his interests in his work was particularly around young men of color and their opportunities or lack thereof in the labor market. And it made me start thinking about future demographic shifts. So here at Urban, there's a recent project called Mapping America's Future, which has simulated, and maybe it's inexact, Ron, but it's simulated future demographic shifts, predicting major growth in the next 20 years for people of color, not probably a surprise to anyone, with slower growth for the white population. However, the share of the white population over the age of 65 is also going to be growing. So I'm curious what you all think, and this is a bit of asking you to speculate a little bit, but what do these future trends portend for political will, and particularly, how do you think these trends might impact the way older voters make decisions about issues and investments in younger and more racially diverse populations, right? So things like funding for school or early childhood or home visiting or pre-K programs or job training programs. Start with Gene.
Well, again, this has to do with much more with politics than economics. As I keep saying, there's tremendous opportunity in front of us. We're not taking advantage of it. So one example is suppose we are going to reform Social Security as a way to long-term get revenues that we would shift towards children. So we've got this budget out of order. Ron just gave you a bunch of statistics. What's the one big budget reform that would have zero or almost zero impact on the elderly? It's Social Security reform, right? I mean, the current elderly are home free. So the fact that this debate gets thrown out politically is the elderly should worry about Social Security reform. There's an exception. They might get a slight COLA or cost of living adjustment. But outside of that, that's the only thing that's ever been suggested they would have to pay. If you raise taxes, they might have to pay. You sort of try to control health costs, they might have to pay. They're not going to pay. So some of this political debate is so out of whack in terms of what we can do that part of it is getting this politics. I think the elderly support help for children, but they also sit around. The Tea Party people or jump right in with the liberals and say, keep government's hands off my Medicare. I earned it, you know. So the debate is really, really confused, and I think it's hard to say in the current campaign that you've got to push for facts, but the facts are out there. There's a lot we can do. But one of the numbers that I have, for instance, is that for a child born today, we're scheduled to spend in direct supports. Now, I've got some growth rate built in here over time, to assume we can keep getting it, about $2 million over their lifetime. $2 million per child in direct supports, and if you count in public goods and defense and the highways and everything, $4 million for each child born today. So we can't do anything. We can't shift any money to try to deal with children's programs or test some of the experiments that people talk about. And I have to say, some of the stuff that I love my colleagues and what they're doing, but some of the stuff they're talking about is small ball relative to these trillions of dollars that are floating around, and the additional trillion plus we'll spend 10 years from now. So I think there is tremendous opportunity out there, but I think we have to reshift the focus on what we can do with our additional resources and get the debate. This is sort of a budget process issue. Get the debate away from what we can't do because we've got these excessive promises we can't meet for low taxes and very high unsustainable benefit growth in a lot of programs.
So give me 1 minute to specify the casket you just referred to.
By the way,
in order to share that growth in the future, we have to change Medicare and Social Security, and we have to retire debt.
And raise
right?
taxes possible.
And taking benefits away from people is the heart of the Democratic Party. They're not going to do it. And raising additional revenues from the rich is the heart of the Republican Party, and they're not going to compromise.
And to be clear, we're not taking benefits. To be clear, we're not taking benefits away from people. It's the debate.
I understand that.
We're reducing a growth rate schedule.
Okay, I understand that, but you can't do it. That's the problem. I love the theory. I read your book. I think it's great, and I love to say, Congress, if they read this and took it to heart and did something about it, it's obvious there are 50 things they could do that would make a big difference. But it's not going to happen because our political system is too dysfunctional.
Okay.
And we're not going to have any presidential leadership, evidently, with either party.
Eternal optimist, Ron. Okay, Belle, last comment on this, and then we're going to go to the audience, where I know there's a lot more hope residing out there.
Well, I think Gene is really very correct in his analysis that these programs like Social Security and Medicare are crowding out everything else. And Ron is also right that the politics of that is horrible. So let me try to address the question you originally asked, which was about the changing demographics of the young and the old. And I hate to sort of pour on more pessimistic oil on the fire here, but I'm afraid that's going to make things worse because the young are increasingly minorities and the old are increasingly white. And the white population, especially the older white population, votes in high numbers, and the young and minority population votes in low numbers. And those older whites are, I'm afraid, not going to be willing to give up their Medicare and their Social Security to invest in a bunch of kids that they don't relate to because they come from another country or another race or whatever. And so it's quite a sad situation. And if I were to get on my soapbox, I would say they need to be convinced that we really are stronger together. But I'm not sure they all see it that way right now.
Line sounds familiar. Okay, we're going to go. We're going to go to the audience. Okay, we'll go over here to Tim. And a mic is coming around to you so our online audience can hear you as well.
It's on. There.
Introduce yourself for those who don't know.
So here's an issue.
Can you introduce yourself because not everybody knows
I'm
you.
Tim Smeening. I'm a professor of public affairs and economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I went to school with Gene. We're in economics together. And I know the other two intimately well from various things we've done together. There's an opportunity. One of the big issues that we're facing right now, and a very well-known criminologist told me this yesterday. We're graduating 700,000 men a year right now from college. We're releasing 700,000 men from prison. I just finished a paper for AEI that of the 5 million 18 to 34s who don't have jobs, at least half of them, and Nick Eberstadt says I'm low, at least half of them have something of a criminal record. These guys are not in employment, education, training. These are mainly young black men, too, who many first and second time offenders. And this program that we're starting, I've talked to some people on the Hill about it and in the White House. This infrastructure program really has to save slots or provide incentives to give these guys a job. Everyone knows how expensive it is to keep the prison cycle going. There's a lot of efforts to reform it on the front end. But I think, and I'd be interested in your reaction, on the back end, we have all these people, many of them fathers, many of them owing child support, many of them owing court-related debt, without transportation, with poor education, who really need, at this point, with the strong labor market, really need to somehow get involved in the world of work. The no-nonsense job is fine, show up and we'll pay you and start paying your child support or something, but we really have to make a concerted effort right now to help these people. And most of them are young African-American men, as a matter of fact.
Anyone in particular want to respond to that question or comment?
Well, I think I tend to agree with it, that this is a huge problem, a huge challenge for the country, that we have so many people coming out of prison and that we have so few job opportunities for them, and employers, for understandable reasons, do discriminate against ex-felons. There's been this big debate about whether we should ban the box, the box on an employment application that requires you to say whether you have a record or not. And we have a debate even about whether that's a good idea, because there's been one study at least that's shown that when you ban the box, then employers discriminate against all young black males because they can't make the distinction between those who've been in prison and those who have not. I don't know. I'm agnostic about which way to go here. I'm just pointing out that there are issues with whatever you do. I do think that there is evidence that some of the transitional jobs programs could work for this group. I've been reading that literature recently, a lot of it done at MDRC, and they have shown that, I think it's the Center for Equal Opportunity, is that what it's called, or Employment Opportunity, has used these jobs programs, and they don't have great impacts on post-program employment and earnings, but they do have good impacts on recidivism, and the reduction in recidivism more than pays for the cost of the program.
I think any society that worries about its long-term future has to worry about what's happening with, I don't want to be sexist about it, but unemployed males create a lot of problems. Out of course, Rock or Columbus, Ohio, or anywhere. and unemployed former prisoners create a lot of problems, and a lot more of them are men than women. I think, and I keep saying this, I think within this budget that I see of a very rich society, we could put a lot more money into work supports of all sorts. And I'm less bothered by the fact, this gets back to what I was saying earlier about relative improvement. And this gets a debate, by the way, among liberals, is if you put more money to work supports, are you willing to say, okay, I'm going to put more money to work supports and less money into food stamps? It's even related a little bit to this child credit issue, which Bell raised, which is, okay, do we put a little more at the bottom, which says, let's not phase it in if you work, let's just give it to you. So but I think we've gone a long way towards the consumption side, promoting consumption, but I think the evidence is fairly clear that programs that mainly promote consumption in the long term decrease private earnings, they decrease private savings, a prime example being what's happening on the retirement side, but there's application here too. I should add, again, in terms of this relative comparison, I love Rudy Penner, one of our colleagues here, who was former CBO director, and he said there's a reason why CBO, at least traditionally, doesn't give much of a rate of return to infrastructure, and that's because by the time they log roll and give everybody something, you get things like a national highway system in Hawaii.
And
Okay,
embrace
I
your
know-
more.
oh.
Can I say something very quickly?
Very quickly.
It'll be a minute. This Brookings AEI group that I talked about, half liberals, half conservatives.
But most
And we
men.
got to the point where the right was hell-bent to have mandatory work requirements in more than we do now in other programs. And the left kept saying, how are you going to make them do it? And the answer, of course, is you're going to sanction them. So if they don't get a job, then you sanction them. That's what's happened in TANF. And so we struck a bargain that the left insists on, which is you can only do that if you guarantee them a job. If they turn down a job that's guaranteed, then you can throw them off. And conservatives, as much as they hate jobs that are guaranteed, it puts the government in the business of generating jobs somehow, which has always been a verboten for conservatives. And at least that group agreed. So I think there may be some possibility here that we could work things out. I'm not in our lifetime, but in somebody's lifetime, maybe in God's lifetime, we'll be able to work this out. But it does make a lot of sense, and we haven't tried it. We need to work it out, and we figure out better ways to do it.
Speaking of people that maybe have some longer lifetimes ahead of them, I know we've got a bunch of graduate students here in the room, and I'd love to hear questions from that group. So I'm looking for hands. Right here, the woman in the maroon wine-colored shirt.
Oh, thank you. So we have a researcher at UW, Dr. Jenny Higgins, who works a lot on pregnancy ambivalence and looks a lot at sort of thinking about how pleasure is missing from the discussions about contraception. But I'm also wondering if one of the things driving ambivalence and childbearing isn't a lot of mystery around what the financial picture should look like for people who are thinking about planning for a pregnancy. And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about maybe some of the ways that might play out in people thinking about what that financial picture should look like before they plan that.
So Belle, do you want to maybe take that? Is there some sort of nexus between financial planning and family planning, or financial education and family planning?
I think there probably is. We're all, a little myopic, and I think particularly when you're young and, if you're less educated, you're even more myopic, meaning, you don't think about tomorrow, you just think about today. And so there's no question that what people say after they have these unplanned pregnancies is they say things like, well, I just wasn't thinking. And they say after they have had a time as usually a single mom, often they're a cohabiting couple in the beginning, but the cohabiting couples break up very fast in the United States. And so then they're on their own and they're trying to do, hold down a job and be a parent at the same time. And they say it's much, much tougher than they ever imagined. If you're interested, there's a nice series that was just done by a public interest reporting group in the state of Maine, where a reporter did an in-depth study of these single moms and what they're struggling with and what they say about the non-choices they made.
Okay, I'm going to now go to a question from our online audience, and this question comes from Randy Carmen Schmidt at the Children's Leadership Council. who's asking, so given the talk about marriage and family composition earlier, including what was in the AEI Brookings report, why hasn't there been more discussion about issues impacting families such as family violence, child abuse, and how to address those issues, particularly with low-income families?
We didn't discuss it here. You didn't ask us about it. But
asking
we have fulsome national policies on abuse and neglect. We're increasing the spending every year on those. We have entitlement programs. I think we're doing a fairly good job. And by the way, that field is building an evidence base about programs that work to reduce family violence. And in fact, there's a clearinghouse in California, California Child Welfare Clearinghouse, that has, it's a thing of beauty. It has all kinds of intervention programs that work with exactly these families, with either the kids or with the adults, and some of the programs work with both of them. So we're doing a lot on that front, and I think we're being more successful.
Others?
I mean, I would just make the distinction between preventing abuse and neglect versus treating it once it happens. Obviously, if there's violence or child abuse or neglect, you have to deal with it when it happens. And as Ron says, we have programs that do that. I really want to, though, also put the emphasis on one way to prevent both domestic violence and child abuse and neglect is, again, to help young people understand it's not a good idea to get involved with someone at an early stage of life before you've understood what your own life is going to be like and what their life is going to be like. And people get into these relationships that don't work out and have a baby together, and that kind of makes it more difficult for, actually increases the incidence of these problems.
So now I want to go to a question actually that, when Gene was laying out the challenges with the federal budget and was thinking about, is there enough political will? How might a new administration bring more attention to issues of children and families? And so my former agency, the Administration for Children and Families, it's currently situated within, most people know, the Department of Health and Human Services. Some folks have suggested, and some states have made moves like this, that if ACF were elevated to a cabinet-level agency and not sort of buried under the HHS framework, would there be more attention to children and family issues, right? ACF has a $50 billion annual budget. That's larger than 8 other cabinet-level agencies. Would that make a difference?
I think it would make a difference, but I think it would be politically almost impossible to get done, and I would not advise a new president to expend political capital on a institutional reform of that sort. Now, I think the other idea that's out there put forward by my colleague Richard Reeves is to create an office of opportunity within the White House. And that, I think, is a lot more doable because a president has the power to create an office in the White House without going to Congress. And but it's a very interesting idea otherwise. I like the idea. I just wonder if it's realistic.
I'm not sure the answer to our government's bureaucratic problem is to add one more agency. Part of it is, I often deal with child advocates and they say we need to have a growing entitlement like everybody else. And I said, you're really a little late at coming to that table. To me, the issue of government organization performance, and I've studied this a lot, I don't think there's any place in the executive branch or even in the Congress where you actually do cross-cutting work across programs and think about how you can reform them. I could go through all the examples, but I don't really have time here. And even one of my favorite agencies, the Congressional Budget Office, they examine sort of issues and programs one at a time. And they don't put forward proposals. And what you really need is the ability within the executive branch to pull things together, like to put out a full, say, study on children's programs across agencies. What does this do to incentives? What does it do to promoting work? And actually, but you don't actually have that capability even put in government. And to me, I would put much more emphasis in that. And by the way, I have to say, somebody who's really strong on this government performance stuff is your own Donald Moynihan at Wisconsin, for those of you from Wisconsin in the audience.
Ron, any
Nope.
thoughts you want to add? Okay. So I'm going to go to another question from our online audience, and this is a question from Julia Cortry, I think at the National Partnership for Women and Families. This question about family leave. She says that, Belle, you wrote about the need for paid leave in your recent report on reducing poverty and improving opportunity. So what opportunities are there for bipartisan compromise around this issue, if any?
Well, I love the question because Brookings and AEI right now are teamed up on a important project to answer that question. And again, it's a group, we have a working group that includes both conservatives and more progressively minded people. And I would say right now, most of the people in our group that's working on this is open-minded about the need for paid family leave. Now, there are disagreements about what form it should take. You know, the current unpaid, first of all, for those of you who don't know, the U.S. is the only country, almost the only country, certainly the only advanced country, that does not have paid sick leave, mandated by the government on employers, does not have paid parental leave when a baby is born, does not have paid leave if you have a spouse or a child or a elder relative that's ill and needs your care. And so we are completely at risk here, especially low-income families, because a lot of employers do provide paid leave to their professional and white-collar and higher-income workers, but not at the bottom. So I think that this is something whose time has come. There is legislation on both the Democratic and the Republican side in the current U.S. Congress. There is at least, both candidates actually, but Hillary Clinton in particular, have made strong proposals in this area for 12 weeks of paid leave around the time of birth, adoption of a baby, and it would be paid. Right now you can take that leave, but it's unpaid. So the only thing that you get is protection of your job. So I could go on and on, but yes, I think it's a very hot issue, and I think there is a possibility we could actually do something this year.
Ron, Jean, agree? Want to add anything?
I would just say I think if you go down this route, you really have to think about government providing a lot of the support, because for the small employer with 2 or 3 people, or say a restaurant owner where you have this turnover every few months, the notion that it is economical for them to provide 12 weeks of leave is going to create a strong disincentive for hiring certain people who may get pregnant and take that leave. And so I think it's important to design it in a way that you face up to those disincentives. I agree that this is an important issue. I'm in favor of paid leave, but I think some of it has to be sponsored by the government. And quite honestly, I think a lot of it is appropriately a middle-class issue, and there's sometimes when we get this debate on help low-income people, we dodge what's going on with the middle class, which I think is part of what's also going on in the election. I think this is an important middle-class issue and should be addressed, but done the right way.
Ron, anything on
No.
family leave? Okay, I think we have time for one more question from the audience right here. And tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Helene Stebbins, and first I am a Follette graduate, so part of the Fight and Bob class of '95, and currently with the Alliance for Early Success. So we invest in state advocacy to improve policies for young children birth through age 8. 2 questions. One is a political question, one is a research question. The political question is, how do we get the political will for prevention policy? So I think there's a tremendous amount of evidence, and people generally agree that it's cheaper to fix these problems in the early years, but the payoff is a very long-term timeline, often longer than political cycles. And we haven't been able to make a good enough case, despite the research, to redirect resources in that direction. So how do we make that case? The second question is about research and is really in response to Ron's comment about home visiting policies or home visiting programs not showing to be very effective in a couple of years. And my question there is about distinguishing between evidence-based programs and scaling up programs, and how we frequently lose the quality and we don't put the resources behind what we need when we go to scale on these programs. And then as researchers, we get caught up in debates about whether or not that was a good program, when in fact we already had the evidence that it was a good program, but we're not good at taking it to scale. So I know those are 2 pretty deep questions, but I'd be curious at your response to either one of those.
Belle, you look like you want to.
I'll take the scaling up question. In the social genome model, we use a series of evidence-based policies that have been shown to be effective, at least in some place somewhere, often in a demonstration program. And we say, suppose we took those programs to scale and we gave them to every low-income child in America, and then we feed those programs through the model, and we show that at the end of this, their lifetime incomes would be much enhanced, and we could close the gap, most of the gap, not all of it, but a large chunk of the gap between low-income children and more advantaged kids by the age of 40 in terms of, you know, their incomes and their chances of being middle class. So then we have some caveats, and the caveat is the one you mentioned. By the way, our model shows such a narrowing of those gaps, both by income and by race, that I think that I've looked at the results, and I think some of my colleagues here would share this concern, and said, can this be true? Could we really achieve that much with just these few programs introduced throughout the life cycle? And one of our answers has been, well, probably if we scaled those programs up, their effectiveness would not be as great as it is in these smaller programs. And also, the model might be wrong. But still, overall, the model gives us a lot of optimism about what you could do. And even if you sort of discount the results somewhat arbitrarily for a diminution of effectiveness with scale up, you still get pretty good results. I mean, that's not a great answer, but it's an issue. I think it's a big issue, scale up. Yeah, right.
So, Braun, what about this question of, like, why don't we have enough political will to pay for programs that are about prevention? Is that true? And if
we do. We spend a fair amount of money on prevention. And in fact, we just made a huge advance if the Senate will pass it. We've been fighting for at least 30 years to get around $7 billion in child protection money freed up to use for prevention and treatment. Now it can only be used when a child is removed from the home, which is a really significant event. Kids who get removed from their home have a completely different trajectory than kids who stay at home. There's a lot of research on this. So we want to prevent that. That would be a big thing to prevent. Keep them at home, treat the parents, treat the kid. The states think they can do it. There are good studies that show that they can. And we've passed legislation that would allow the states a big first step, maybe a moderate first step, in taking money from that money that now can only be used once a child has been removed from their home and use it for prevention programs. I think this is the biggest step that we've made in this area in 20 years probably. And all that remains is for the Senate to pass it. And there's no objection to it, but it's tied up with other things the Senate doesn't like, and I don't know if they're going to be able to work this out, but that would be an example of doing exactly what you're urging the country to do. I want to say one thing about scale up. Scale up, that is where we are now. We don't know how to scale up. Even a program that has a very strong evidence base, as I've already shown, and I think we're going to show it again with home visiting programs, we are not successful. So that is a new enterprise that we need to focus on like a laser. What are the 3 characteristics of this program that you have to do well in order to scale up? That kind of thing. And I think we're going to do it. We already have somewhat of a research base there, but we just don't know enough of it. Scaling up programs. And without scaling up, forget it.
Okay. So we have 3 minutes left. And what I would love to do, because we live in interesting and challenging times, I want to end on hope. Right? I don't think we have enough of that right now in the world. So, I mean, you guys are going to say what you want to say anyway, but I'm going to try to push you. I'm going to try to push you, Ron. I'm going to make you go first, too. I'm going to go the other way. What's one thing, as you think about a new administration, just one thing that you're actually hopeful about, given where we are in time?
I would be hopeful if the next administration can pick up where this administration left off. If it's a Clinton administration, I think we will. I think she'll be very appreciative of what's been done in evidence-based policy, and will continue at least the things that are done in the administration now, and it will continue to expand. To a certain extent, the new president couldn't stop it because it has its own inertia now, its own plowing ahead. Foundations are invested, states are invested, cities are invested. It's growing like mad. So, but we need to have the federal leadership, and I would be hopeful if Clinton would do that.
Okay, very good. Belle?
Well, as I already sort of indicated, I'm optimistic about paid leave. I'm optimistic about the Earned Income Tax Credit. I'm optimistic about a child tax credit with refundability and even more refundability than we have now. And I'm somewhat optimistic even about pre-K, especially the federal government encouraging the states to do more.
Okay. And Gene?
So although I think this is a broad 21st century issue, I think there's momentum towards a type of compromise which says let's do a lot more to help people in terms of encouraging them to work. That's reflected in this, what Belle's already said about the compromise on the Earned Income Tax Credit. And one that we didn't mention because it's a little more often at the middle class levels, but asset development, but in terms of more wealth ownership. I think there's momentum there. And there's another area that's percolating, and I'm not sure how it's going to play out. And that's related a bit to the last question on the prevention side. I mean, if you go where the bucks are in healthcare, and the growth is in healthcare. And a lot of people have figured out how to take that healthcare budget and reorient it. I've talked about reducing its growth rate so we could do other things. But I think there's momentum within, even among health providers, to trying to do a lot more in prevention and defining prevention, as my colleague Lottie Aaron would say, in a much more expansive way than acute health care. It means actually the types of preventive types of activities that Ron and Belle spoke about. So actually I see these are areas where there's political compromise if we can free up at least some resources to do it.
Okay, I want to check back with all three of you in like another couple of months and see how this plays out. So with that, I'm going to close things out. I want to thank the Urban Institute, the University of Wisconsin, La Follette School. I want to thank Molly Offner and our virtual and online audiences. And finally, please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you.